Just before I begin, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Julian Benedict and Roz and Dara Truscott and everyone here at the Simon Fraser University Seniors Forum for giving me the opportunity to come and talk to you. Thank you all also for coming to, I guess, steal a line from Tom Waits. It would have been real strange if nobody had turned up. So thank you for choosing to come and listen to me instead of going out and enjoying the wonderful sunshine as we have our rather late Vancouver summer this year. Now, to set the scene, I'd like to start with a quotation from a work by a Muslim emir called Usama ibn Munkith, who died in 1188. In it, he describes an experience that he had in Jerusalem with some Franks. Franks was the... Let's have that one back, shall we? Hey! Stop. Let's try that. My remote control is... yeah, okay. Right. So an experience he had with some Franks. The term Franks was a term that Muslims of the Middle East used for Europeans in a sort of general sense. And he's talking about a visit that he made to Jerusalem and what happened to him there. And I'm quoting from Paul Cobb's translation of Usama's work. When I went to visit the holy sites in Jerusalem, I would go in and make my way up to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, besides which stood a small mosque that the Franks had converted into a church. When I went into the Al-Aqsa Mosque, where the Templars, who were my friends, were, they would clear out that little mosque so that I could pray in it. One day I went into the little mosque, recited the opening formula, God is great, and stood up in prayer. At this, one of the Franks rushed at me and grabbed me and turned my face to the east, saying, "Pray like this." A group of Templars hurried towards him, took hold of him, and took him away from me. I then returned to my prayers. The Frank, that very same one, took advantage of their inattention and returned, rushing upon me and turning my face to the east, saying, "Pray like this." So the Templars came in again, grabbed him, and threw him out. They apologized to me, saying, "This man is a stranger, just arrived from the Frankish lands sometime in the past few days. He has never before seen anyone who didn't pray towards the east." "I think I've prayed enough," I said, and I left. I used to marvel at that devil, the change of his expression, the way he trembled, and what he must have made of someone who prayed towards Mecca. Now, I'm not going to explain immediately why I brought this story up, but I would like to ask you to bear it in mind as we proceed with our discussion today, as it raises a number of matters that I would like to address. So, to move to the first question that I asked in the title of this forum, what were the Crusades? Well, most history books will tell you that the Crusades began on November the 27th, 1095, when at a major meeting of clerics at Clermont in France, Pope Urban II preached the first of a number of sermons calling for a military expedition to the east. The expedition was intended to aid the Christians of the Levant, who, as he said, were suffering under the yoke of Muslim oppression. Urban was responding to calls by the Byzantine emperor for aid, as well as having his own reasons for calling the crusade. He needed to assert his authority at a time when it was questioned. And he also wanted to redirect the aggression of the rather unruly nobility of Europe, who at the time were spending a lot of time fighting each other, and he felt it would be better if they went off and fought someone else. Urban offered his listeners remission of penance for their sins. They merely had to take the cross and travel to the east, and many responded enthusiastically. Large armies of European soldiers and pilgrims, mostly led by important members of the nobility, took the cross, travelled to the Levant, and over the course of about a decade, established 4 Catholic Christian states in the region, based at Edessa, Antioch, Tripoli, and in Jerusalem, or around Jerusalem. The conquest of Jerusalem itself, on July the 15th, 1099, seems to have been a particularly bloody affair, with a great slaughter of Muslim and Jewish men, women, and children alike. Chroniclers tell us that the Crusaders burned the synagogue down around the ears of the Jews who had taken refuge there. And others tell us that the Crusaders waded in blood around the Temple Mount that came up to their ankles. Now, the success of the First Crusade, as we call this expedition, is often ascribed to the fact that Muslims of the Levant were at the time divided and conducting wars against each other, rather like the European nobility. Soon after the arrival of the Crusades, though, Muslim poets and preachers began to call the political authorities of the time to unite and respond to the Frankish invasion. I have one example here. This is the first page of a treatise on the Holy War by a Damascene jurisprudent called Ali ibn Tahir as-Sulami. And in this, he calls his fellow Muslims to go out and fight against the Crusaders. This was written in about 1105. However, Muslim rulers continued to be preoccupied with their own internal conflicts, especially when they realized that they could form alliances with the Franks against other Muslim rulers, or against other Frankish rulers, or against both. We actually have cases of battles that were fought with Muslims and Franks united on each side of the battlefield fighting against each other. The Franks, as you can tell, were equally enthusiastic about taking part in this. So, at least at the outset, realpolitik very much trumped any sort of principle. In the meantime, the Crusaders settled in the Levant, established permanent homes, raised crops, raised children, and became, in a sense, locals. Over time, there appeared Muslim rulers who seemed to have been determined to retake the territory that had been lost to the Franks. In 1144, a Turkish emir by the name of Imad ad-Din Zangi took Edessa, bringing the first of the Crusader capitals back under Muslim control, or actually under Muslim control. It was originally under Armenian control. Whether he did this from a pious desire to pursue the Holy War, or alternatively simply because he wanted to expand his own territory, is something that is open to debate. I lean more towards the side that he was trying to expand his own territory, but both sides are proposed. The collapse of the county of Edessa sent reverberations through Europe and led to another crusade 4 years later. And so it went on. Over the next 150 years, there were periodic conflicts between Muslims and Franks, or Crusaders, usually resulting either from the arrival of a crusade from Europe or from the appearance of a Muslim ruler who was determined to undertake the Holy War against the Franks. Probably the best known examples, wake up, there we go, are Richard the Lionheart of England and his archenemy Salah ad-Din, Saladin. Here you actually have a medieval depiction of Richard on his horseback here, running Saladin through with a lance. The two actually never fought each other face to face on the battlefield. The struggle for control over the coast continued throughout the 13th century. But by the latter half of that century, Egypt, the Holy Land, and Syria had come under the control of a series of militaristic rulers known as the Mamluks. And they were rather enthusiastic pursuers of the counter-crusade. And they gradually conquered the Frankish cities and fortresses. And here you can see as it gets progressively darker green is the more recent that the conquest was. So you can see they gradually sort of pushed the Crusaders off the coast. The last Christian stronghold on the coast, Acre, fell to the Mamluks in 1291. Although periodic attacks were made on the Levantine coast thereafter by Crusaders, the next major European campaigns in the region only really took place in the 18th and 19th centuries. Now, what I've told you seems like a very convenient, simple history of a 200-year period of conflict between Europeans and Muslims. And I should emphasize that I've only concentrated here on what we might call the core period of the Crusades and the core region of the Crusades. Historians have expanded their views quite widely in their discussions of what constituted a crusade and where the Crusades took place. Spain is the obvious example. But I don't have time to address that here, because there are other things I want to talk about. But you may have noticed two things from the summary of events that I've given you. Firstly, although I've used the expression holy war a few times, I've never used the word jihad. Secondly, I've tried to emphasize the fact that the violence between Franks and Muslims was somewhat sporadic, occurring in bursts, if you like, throughout the 200-year period, rather than being a sort of continuous state of total war. So let's think about each of these in turn, and we'll start with the question of jihad. The Arabic word, jihad, is often used in the media as a synonym for holy war. But that's a rather superficial and inaccurate understanding of the term. The original meaning of the Arabic word is a struggle waged on behalf of the faith, which can take almost any form. Military action is merely one aspect of this. The Quran, you have an example of a Quranic manuscript up here, the Quran, the Muslim holy book, shows a rather mixed and at times contradictory attitude towards violence. Some passages encourage Muslims to turn away peacefully from people who oppose them. Others encourage Muslims to fight against the people who oppose them, either defensively or offensively, though the fighting is circumscribed by limits on your behavior on the battlefield. Muslim scholars resolved these apparent conflicts in the text, if you'll pardon the pun, by developing theories of abrogation, the idea that one passage would be superseded by another passage. With regard to the development of the Quran's teaching on warfare, Muslim scholars linked the passages very intimately with the lifetime of the Prophet Muhammad. Muhammad had started receiving the divine revelation in Mecca, but he'd been opposed by the local people and had eventually had to leave. And he moved to Medina, where he established a Muslim community, and then eventually was able to retake Mecca again. So the reading of the Quran that the Muslim scholars took very much emphasized this sequence of events in the Prophet's lifetime. He had initially been instructed to argue peacefully with his opponents and to turn away from them if they weren't interested. But then later on he'd been authorized to wage defensive warfare and then offensive warfare against his opponents in Mecca. After the death of the Prophet in 632, the Muslim campaigns, as they extended their hold over the Middle East and North Africa, were fought in the name of the military jihad. But as the pace of conquest slowed, Muslim scholars elaborated on the Quran's teachings to formalize the making of treaties with the enemy, as well as codifying the regulations that the military jihad had to be fought within, including such things as not killing non-combatants, not destroying property, not killing oneself on the battlefield deliberately, and according not just tolerated but actually protected status to non-Muslims who lived under Muslim rule. These are all things that obviously have some relevance today. Also, by the 12th century, Muslim scholars had developed a theory of jihad that divided it up into al-jihad al-akbar, the greater jihad, and al-jihad al-asghar, the lesser jihad. The greater jihad was seen as a struggle waged externally through speaking in defense of the faith or writing in defense of the faith, and above all and most importantly internally, against one's own inner sinfulness and disobedience to God. This is another section of As-Sulami's work that I showed you earlier, and he actually has a passage there where he says, وَقَدِّمُوا جِهَادْ أَنفُسَكُمْ عَلَى جِهَادْ أَعْدَائِكُمْ. Everyone got that? Give precedence to jihad of your souls or yourselves over jihad of your enemies. And he goes on and talks in more detail about what he means. That's in 1105. The lesser jihad, in the meantime, was the military jihad, with all the restrictions that it had to be fought within. So, many of the Muslim rulers who undertook the holy war against the Crusaders also presented themselves as pious promoters of the Muslim faith in other ways. They sponsored the foundation of mosques and religious colleges and other institutions. They sought to be seen as just and moral rulers, and so on. This is the funerary madrasa, the funerary religious college of Nur ad-Din, who was in some senses Saladin's predecessor in the counter-crusade. So it's a mixture of a religious college and also Nur ad-Din's tomb, which are in the same building. Here's Saladin himself. This is actually a contemporary portrait of Saladin. And his biographer, a chap called Baha'u'd-Din ibn Shaddad, states that his master was, and I'm quoting here, just, gentle, and merciful, a supporter of the weak against the strong. Every Monday and Thursday, he used to sit to dispense justice in public session, attended by the jurisconsults, the qadis, and the doctors of religion. The door would be open to litigants, so that everyone, great and small, senile women and old men, might have access to him. So, what we see in this description is Saladin attempting to give serious attention to the fact that the jihad is something more than simply waging war on the battlefield. Of course, as Baha'u'd-Din tells us, Saladin was also enthusiastic on the battlefield too. Most Muslims today adopt the view of jihad that I've just outlined. It was a struggle waged for the faith in various ways. Above all, in seeking to be personally pious and obedient to God, and good in one's conduct. With regard to the lesser or military jihad, violence is absolutely the last resort and must only be undertaken within restrictions. Now, returning to the crusading period, the second point that I've made in my summary of events was that the battles that occurred between the Muslims and the Franks were rather intermittent affairs, rather than something continuous. Thank you. Naturally, I don't want to minimize the importance of these wars. The battles that were fought were vicious and bloody, and involved the deaths and enslavement of thousands of people on both sides. But if we only pay attention to the battles, we miss half the story. Let's think again about the story with which I opened this talk. Usama, a Muslim emir, went to pray in a small mosque next to the Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Okay. Fine. The mosque, I should stop moving around really, shouldn't I? You should glue my feet to the floor. Okay. What was I? Right, yes, mosque, Jerusalem, yes. The mosque had been converted into a church by the Templars. Now, the Templars, or to give them their full name, the Order of the Knights of the Temple, were an organization of essentially warrior monks that was founded in the early 12th century to protect pilgrims on the pilgrimage routes to Jerusalem. As a result of papal favor and patronage by the nobility of both Europe and the Middle East, by which I mean the Frankish nobility, of course, they quickly grew in wealth and power. And in the process, they became among the staunchest defenders of the Latin Christian states of the Levant. These, then, are the people whom Usama calls his friends, who vacate a church so that he can come in and conduct a Muslim prayer ritual, and who apologize to him after having had to manhandle away one of their own number who was trying to get him to pray towards the east. Now, we have to admit that Usama was a talented storyteller who never let the facts get in the way of a good yarn. But if this account gives even only a partially true account, then it indicates that between the battles, there were much more cordial relations between Muslims and Franks than we might think from the earlier summary that I gave you. These more cooperative relations manifested in a number of ways. I've already referred to the alliances that were made between Muslims and Franks. Even before the Crusades, there had been trade going on between the Levant and Europe. And soon after, many of the Italian maritime cities, who were the primary mercantile powers of the time, established communities in the major ports of the Crusader states. negotiating for trade privileges from the rulers. Muslim rulers, including Saladin, also encouraged these merchants, recognizing the lucrative possibilities that trade could bring. Indeed, a number of Muslim cities, most notably Alexandria, contained hostels where foreign merchants could live while they were there. Trade continued to flourish throughout the period. In fact, if there was a major conflict between Muslims and Franks, trade would undergo a temporary hiatus. For example, trade was suspended in 1187 when Saladin took Jerusalem from the Crusaders, from the Franks. But then it started again in 1192, after he and Richard the Lionheart had finished fighting each other up and down the coast and had made a truce. Such busy mercantile relations, of course, didn't escape the eyes of the church. And there were a number of popes who severely criticized them, objecting to trade with the infidel. Particularly as Muslims would buy wood, iron, and naval supplies from Western merchants, which they would then use to equip armies and navies to go out and fight against the Franks. Iron and wood are the main things you need to build useful stuff like siege towers and trebuchets. After the fall of Acre in 1291, a number of popes tried to ban the trade between Europe and the Middle East, but these bans never really stuck. There was too much money to be made, frankly. It wasn't only goods that passed from east to west. By the time of the Crusades, many works of classical wisdom, along with syntheses of them by Middle Eastern authors, had actually been passing to Europe for centuries, primarily through Spain. With the onset of the Crusades, this transfer continued, and such texts were instrumental in the European intellectual revolution of the period, known to historians as the 12th century Renaissance. This is an example. My wife is here listening, she's a mathematician, so this is actually a book on algebra. Kitab al-Jabr wal-Muqabala, which is a book on algebra by Al-Khwarizmi, who is the mathematician from whom we actually get the word algorithm. And actually, the title of his book is where we get the word algebra from. This was actually written in the 9th century, but then passed into Europe in the 12th century through, obviously, later copies. The first Latin translation of the Quran was also made during the crusading period in 1143. Although in this case, the primary purpose of translating the Quran was to allow Western European clergymen access to it so that they could refute it. Local events also brought Muslims and Franks together in cities. The Spanish Muslim traveller Ibn Jubayr travelled through the Levant on his way to perform the Muslim Greater Pilgrimage in 1183 to 1185. He was performing the pilgrimage actually to expiate his guilt at having drunk 7 cups of wine, drinking of alcohol being forbidden in mainstream Muslim teaching. In his travelogue, he tells us that he witnessed a bridal procession in the Frankish city of Tyre, which was attended by both Muslims and Franks. He describes the procession in great detail, including the bride, and the words he uses are thus: "She was most elegantly garbed in a beautiful dress, from which trailed, according to their traditional style, a long train of golden silk. On her head she wore a golden diadem, covered by a net of woven gold, and on her breast was a like arrangement. Proud she was in her ornaments and dress, walking with little steps of half a span, like a dove, or in the manner of a wisp of cloud." Ibn Jubayr, perhaps reproaching himself for his interest, then comments, "God protect us from the seduction of such a sight." Other sources for the period also describe Frankish festivities, and so it seems that there were times when Muslims and Franks would come together to enjoy each other's celebrations. It's also important to remember that Muslims continued to live in Frankish territory during the period. We know from various sources that the Frankish conquest of the Levantine coast was not accompanied by a mass evacuation of all Muslims from those territories to Muslim lands. Certainly there were some who fled their homes, we can't deny that. But there were also others who chose to stay not really seeing a major change in their circumstances except for who they paid taxes to. Ibn Jubayr, again, gives us some insight into this, and he's disapproving, of course. He comments that in some places, Muslims under Frankish rule actually enjoy a more comfortable life than they would if they were living under Muslim rule in the neighboring states. In the process, he's criticizing both the Muslims who live under the Franks for not moving to Muslim territory, and also at the same time the Muslim rulers who don't rule their lands justly, so that there are Muslims who prefer to live under the Franks. Yet how did the Franks themselves feel about this situation? Fulcher of Chartres, who was a participant in the First Crusade and was chaplain to King Baldwin I of Jerusalem, expresses his opinion with this rather idyllic description, and here I'm quoting from Ryan and Fink's translation. "Consider, I pray, and reflect how in our time God has transformed the Occident into the Orient. For we who are Occidentals have now become Orientals. He who was a Roman or a Frank has in this land been made into a Galilean or a Palestinian. He who was of Rheims or Chartres has now become a citizen of Tyre or Antioch. We have already forgotten the places of our birth. Already these are unknown to many of us, or not mentioned anymore. Some have already taken homes or households by inheritance. Some have taken wives, not only of their own people, but Syrians and Armenians, by which I mean Syriac or Armenian Christians. Or even Saracens who have obtained the grace of baptism. One has his father-in-law as well as his daughter-in-law living with him, or his own child, if not his stepson or stepfather. Out here there are great-grandchildren and grandchildren. Some tend vineyards, others till fields. People use the eloquence and idioms of diverse languages in conversing back and forth. Words of different languages have become common property, known to each nationality, and mutual faith unites those who are ignorant of their descent." Now I'm going to leave aside the question of whether or not this account is meant to be taken as a true description, or if it's meant to be propaganda intended to attract people to come out and populate the Holy Land. But it's striking how quickly the Franks seem to have seen themselves as locals, as natives, if you like, considering that they'd only arrived 2 or 3 decades earlier. We know that the Franks did, to a certain extent, go native, in that they adopted some Middle Eastern customs, Middle Eastern dress, Middle Eastern diet to a certain extent, that were basically things that were more suited to the local environment. Fulcher's comments do seem to acknowledge that to a certain extent, but it's also equally striking how important Christianity was to Fulcher. This is not surprising, I suppose, given that he was an important clergyman. But what he describes then tells us that the Crusaders' integration into the region included intermarriage with the local people, but there were limits. They would only intermarry with local Christians or people who had become Christian, although at the same time he wasn't picky about what sort of Christianity people followed. But this qualifier is important, as we'll see in a minute. But before I talk about that, I'd first of all like to tell you another rather different story, again drawn from the work of Usama ibn Munkith, who was the author of the story I told you at the beginning of the talk. The major account, or the major text that we have from Usama, there are a number, but the most famous one is a book called Kitab al-I'tibar, the Book of Contemplation, which purports to be Usama's memoirs. But if you read it, you realize that it's very carefully constructed as a literary text, and it's intended really to function as a guide to good conduct for his offspring and succeeding generations. The story of the Templars that I told you is in a section that he devotes to describing the oddities of the Frankish character. And in this, he covers a range of topics, including the Franks' medicine, justice, and also lack of jealousy and sexual matters. Among the last, let's face it, the last is the most interesting, right? Among the last is the following well-known anecdote. And again, I'm quoting Cobb's translation. Here is an example that I myself witnessed. Whenever I went to Nablus, this is Nablus, I used to stay at the home of a man called Mu'iz, whose home was a lodging house for the Muslims. The house had windows that opened onto the road, and across from it, on the other side of the road, was a house belonging to a Frankish man who sold wine for the merchants. He would take some wine in a bottle and go around advertising it, saying, So and so the merchant has just opened a cask of this wine. Whoever wishes to buy some can find it at such and such a place. And the fee he charged for making that announcement was the wine in the bottle. So one day he came back home and discovered a man in bed with his wife. The Frank said to the man, "What business brings you here to my wife?" "I got tired," the man replied, "so I came in to rest." "But how did you get into my bed?" asked the Frank. "I found a bed that was all made up, so I went to sleep in it," he replied. "While my wife was sleeping there with you?" the Frank pursued. "Well, it's her bed," the man offered. "Who am I to keep her out of it?" "By the truth of my religion," the Frank said, "if you do this again, we'll have an argument, you and I." And that was all the disapproval he would muster and the extent of his sense of propriety. Now, this story is obviously a joke, but I'd also suggest that it's a joke that Usama didn't get. He begins by claiming that he witnessed the incident himself, but even allowing for the fact that medieval houses could be built very close to each other across streets, this seems pretty unlikely. I'd say it's more likely that he's claiming he saw it himself so that people are more likely to believe him. Saw it myself, Gov, with my own two eyes. He then gives us an account of a man who sells wine for the merchants, something that a Muslim would look down on. Although it's not explicitly stated, the implication of the way that the man sells the wine is that he allows others to taste from the bottle that he's carrying around, so that they'll then think, "Great wine, I'll go off and buy a bunch from so-and-so the merchant." And then his payment at the end of the day is the wine that's in the bottle. This suggests that the man is not very intelligent, which then explains why he doesn't realize that he has been cuckolded when he gets home and finds someone in bed with his wife. But Usama's shocked comment at the end of the anecdote about the wine seller's lack of jealousy is actually quite illuminating. As I've said, the story is clearly a joke, and in particular it bears the marks of a genre of medieval European literature known as the fabliaux, humorous tales that often centre around the bawdy activities of the common folk. In particular, a common storyline in the fabliaux is the cuckolding and deception of a husband who is so stupid that he doesn't realise that his wife has been unfaithful. Usama's tale fits well into this mould, and I'd suggest that he heard the story from one of his Frankish friends, who told it to him as a joke, to entertain him. But as indicated by his last comment, Usama took it seriously, and then incorporated it into his work. So regardless of whatever other exchanges took place between Franks and Muslims, it seems that humour didn't transfer safely across the cultural divide. Now, Usama's tale of the cuckolded Frank, along with the other stories that I've mentioned in this lecture, express two major features of Frankish-Muslim relations that are worth noting before we go on to discuss the importance of the Crusades today. First, however closely Muslims and Franks interacted with each other, however often they traded goods, shared space, or broke bread together, there were limits to how far they were able to gain a true understanding of one another. Usama's inability to understand that he was being told a joke is one example of this. Secondly, the limits of Muslim-Frankish understanding grew out of the fact that each side saw itself as being inherently superior to the other, a superiority that was grounded in a sense of religious rectitude. Fulka only approves of Saracens, as he calls them, who have been baptized. The newly arrived Frank, who keeps pointing Usama's head towards the east, simply cannot conceive of the idea that there is a different way to pray. And Ibn Jubayr states that Muslims living under Frankish rule should move to live under Muslim rule, even as he acknowledges in the same breath that the Muslim rulers, or at least some of them, rule their subjects less fairly than the Franks do. For these writers, following the correct religion gave them a sense of superiority over others that included an implicit assumption that those who didn't follow their religion had nothing to teach them beyond superficial things like how to dress in the Middle Eastern heat. But at the same time, for about 2 centuries, for most of the time, Muslims and Franks lived alongside each other, interacted with each other, in peace, despite the fact but from time to time, armed conflict would flare up between them. Now, I'm going to move on to the importance of the Crusades today, and I'd like to talk very briefly about their legacy in the West before talking in a bit more detail about their impact on the Middle East. The Crusades, though, are such a familiar and widespread element in our perception, or in the West at least, of medieval history, that the term crusade itself has become synonymous with pretty much any concerted effort that is made to accomplish something, without any religious connotations necessarily being implied. Yet at the same time, the idea of dashing knights charging out on a noble, heroic, and holy quest is one that continues to fascinate us, as can be seen from the ongoing popularity of movies like Kingdom of Heaven. There are some, though, who seek to draw in a more serious way on the heritage of the Crusades, for good or ill. The modern St. John Ambulance Foundation was founded in the 19th century by English knights of the Order of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem, a modern successor of the so-called Knights Hospitaller, who in the 12th century formed an organization of warrior monks similar to that of the Templars, but devoted to care of the sick as well as defense of the Crusader states. The Order of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem and other organizations based on the military orders normally devote their efforts to charitable work and healthcare today, and they continue to be around behind a number of healthcare organizations. But the legacy of the Crusades and of the military orders in particular has also raised its head in a rather uglier fashion in recent news. It was recently reported that Anders Behring Breivik, the white supremacist who killed 77 people in 2 terror attacks in Norway on July the 22nd, was heavily inspired by the history of the Knights Templar and claimed to be a member of an organization called the Knights Templar Europe, dedicated to combating what he called the Islamization of Europe. So in this way, we see the powerful resonances of one element of crusading history being employed or being used as inspiration for 2 very different and diametrically opposed purposes. Yet what of the Crusades' impact on the Middle East? I would actually argue that the Crusades have had more impact on the modern Middle East than they had on the medieval Middle East. This is not to deny the immense loss of life and damage that occurred during the crusading period. But at the same time, it's important to remember that the Muslim world stretched at the time from Spain and North Africa in the west, all the way across into the Levant, but then out Arabia, Persia, all the way out to northern India, and then right down into parts of Africa as well. So, while there were, of course, wars going on between Christians and Muslims in the Iberian Peninsula at the time as well, and crusaders were involved in these, for many of the inhabitants of the Muslim world, the Crusades were simply something that was happening very far away and had absolutely no relevance as far as their own lives were concerned. You know, a Muslim merchant in Bukhara had no particular interest in the Crusades. This was also partially by design of the Levantine Muslim rulers of the time. The Sultan of Baghdad sent a number of military expeditions between 1110 and 1115 to help the Muslims of the Levant against the Crusaders. But these expeditions were opposed by the Muslim rulers of the Levant because they were worried that they were going to lose their independence to the Sultan of Baghdad. And they were so fiercely defensive about their independence that they actually formed alliances with the Franks against the Sultan's forces. The Sultan turned away in disgust to look to his affairs further east, and the Levantine rulers were left to deal with the Franks on their own. So why are the Crusades such a sensitive topic today? On September the 16th, 2001, in the wake of the tragic events of 9/11, which are, it will be 10 years since 9/11 tomorrow. In the wake of those events, the US President George W. Bush said, "This crusade, this war on terrorism is going to take a while." Those of us who work on Islam cringed, as did many Muslims across the world. Because in using the word crusade, Mr. Bush had raised for many Muslims the spectre of a period that is seen by them as one of Christian hostility and violence against them. In the process, he also played directly into the rhetorical hands of his opponents. I'll return to that later. But first, let's think about how the Crusades have been understood in the Middle East in recent centuries. And here I'll note that I'm drawing heavily on the work of Karel Hillenbrand. The first histories of the Crusades to appear in the Middle East were published in the 19th century. And it's from this time that the Arabic term most commonly used to refer to the Crusades, al-Hurub al-Salabiyya, the cross wars, dates. These works included both a translation of a European text and an original work written using the medieval Arabic sources. It's significant that the author of the second of these, the Egyptian scholar Sayyid Ali al-Hariri, recognized that history could be harnessed for political reasons. He writes, "Our most glorious Sultan Abdul Hamid II, the Ottoman Sultan who you see here, reigned 1876 to 1909. The Sultan has rightly remarked that Europe is carrying out a crusade against us in the form of a political campaign." Abdul Hamid's comment was taken up and widely disseminated in the press across the Middle East and became seen as increasingly appropriate as European imperial power expanded in the region. At the same time, there was a rise in prominence of the image of Saladin as the quintessential counter-crusader. Before this period, there were two heroes of the counter-crusade who enjoyed more prominence in popular memory. The first of these was Nur ad-Din, whose tomb madrasa I showed you earlier on. Saladin served under Nur ad-Din, and Nur ad-Din himself was famous for both his piety and his zeal in pursuing the jihad against the Franks. This is actually a manuscript of the Quran, which was donated by Nur ad-Din in 1167 to a madrasa in Damascus. The second famous counter-crusader was the Mamluk Sultan, Baybars, reigns 1260 to 1277. He was famous both for halting the Mongol invasion of Syria and for taking the Crusader stronghold of Antioch. And he became a major figure in Arabic folk literature. This is a coin from his reign, which bears both his name and also his blazon, which was a lion or a panther. He was very fond of this blazon. He used it everywhere on architectural monuments and coins and all sorts of things. So it was only really as the glowing image that Saladin enjoyed in European literature and history, such as in Sir Walter Scott's The Talisman, permeated the Middle East, that he became viewed as the jihad fighter par excellence, a position that he continued to enjoy thereafter and continues to enjoy today in popular memory in the Middle East. Saddam Hussein, for example, had himself portrayed as a latter-day Saladin. Both men came from the same city, Tikrit, in Iraq. But there's an awful irony here when one remembers that Saladin was a Kurd. Saddam Hussein, of course, wiped out hundreds of thousands of Kurds during his presidency. Now, returning more directly to the question of the Crusades in political discussions, an influential figure in the development of much of today's extremist rhetoric was the Egyptian Sayyid Qutb, a member of the Muslim Brotherhood who was executed for treason in 1966. Qutb saw the Crusades as part of a wider sequence of conflicts between Muslims and non-Muslims that began with the Muslim conquests of the 7th to 8th centuries. He asserted that the term crusade should be understood to mean all Christian attacks on Muslims, even including Christian opposition to the early Muslim expansion of the 7th and 8th centuries. Qutb also expanded his view of what constituted crusading to encompass both Zionism and Western imperialism. Thus, in modern times, it was acceptable to talk about Jewish crusading as well as Christian crusading, and he saw these as manifestations of an ongoing desire by Christians and Jews. Are you all right? as manifestations of an ongoing desire by Christians and Jews to exterminate Islam, a doctrinal aim that was disguised as conflicts over land or military or economic resources. He maintained that this desire had to be opposed by force if necessary. Qutb's writings were extremely influential in the development of later movements like Hamas and Al-Qaeda. In the meantime, the Muslim Brotherhood itself turned away from violence, something for which it was actually criticized by jihadists like Osama bin Laden, or Osama bin Laden if you prefer. The Charter of Hamas, which currently controls the Gaza Strip, adopts a position that very much follows that laid out by Qutb. It sees Palestine as being occupied by the Zionist enemy, and the movement was therefore originally dedicated to the destruction of Israel. From the Charter's perspective, the Zionist occupation is the latest episode in a sequence of Western attacks on the Holy Land that include the Crusades and, again, like the Crusades, will only be successfully repulsed through fighting for the cause of God in the military jihad. Recently, Hamas has moderated its stance somewhat, but it remains dedicated to a military struggle on behalf of Palestinians. The Charter also expresses a desire to establish an Islamic State in the area. Militant sentiment and piety are seen as going hand in hand. And the religious impulse manifests in particular in the extensive social welfare programs that the movement runs. After winning the Palestinian Authority elections in 2006, Hamas refused to sign peace agreements previously made by the Palestinian Authority with Israel and refused to renounce violence. At the same time, it did offer a 10-year truce in exchange for the withdrawal of Israeli troops from the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem. This is one indication of how recently more moderate figures have begun to attain prominence in the movement, which hopefully is a good sign for Israeli-Palestinian diplomacy in the future. The other movement that I mentioned in connection with Sayyid Qutb was Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda was founded in the late 1980s by Osama bin Laden with the objective of removing foreign presence and interference from Muslim countries and creating an Islamic State that would unite the Muslim world. It's now a multinational network that seeks to conduct terrorist actions to achieve its aims. The US became Osama bin Laden's first target because, he maintained, it supported un-Islamic regimes in the Middle East and thus was propping up the first barriers to the formation of an Islamic State. Like Hamas, Al-Qaeda uses counter-crusading rhetoric. One statement issued by Osama ibn Laden and his associates in 1988, 7 years after the Gulf War undertaken to eject Iraqi forces from Kuwait in 1990 to 91, asserts the following, and here I'm reading from Akram Khatta's translation. No one argues today about three facts that are known to everyone. We will list them in order to remind everyone. First, over 7 years, the United States has been occupying the lands of Islam in the holiest of places, the Arabian Peninsula, plundering its riches, dictating to its rulers, humiliating its people, terrorizing its neighbors, and turning its bases in the peninsula into a spearhead through which to fight the neighboring Muslim peoples. Second, despite the great devastation inflicted on the Iraqi people by the Crusader-Zionist alliance, and despite the huge number of those killed, which has exceeded 1 million, despite all this, the Americans are once again trying to repeat the horrific massacres, as though they're not content with the protracted blockade imposed after the ferocious war or the fragmentation and devastation. So here they come to annihilate what is left of its people and to humiliate their Muslim neighbors. Thirdly, if the Americans' aims behind these wars are religious and economic, the aim is also to serve the Jews' petty state and divert attention from its occupation of Jerusalem and murder of Muslims there. The best proof of this is their eagerness to destroy Iraq, the strongest neighboring Arab state, and their endeavor to fragment all the states of the region, such as Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Sudan, into paper statelets, and through their disunion and weakness to guarantee Israel's survival and the continuance of the brutal crusade occupation of the peninsula. All these crimes and sins committed by the Americans are a clear declaration of war on God, his messenger, and Muslims. So Osama bin Laden would have us see it. Now, note how this statement links the war in Iraq with the state of Israel. According to Ibn Laden and his associates, military action undertaken by the Americans is intended above all to preserve the State of Israel and support the ongoing crusading activities of the Americans, activities that are presented as a war against Islam itself. Now you see why it was so unfortunate that President Bush used the word crusade to describe the war on terror. Now, you may recall that early on in this talk I remarked that medieval Muslim religious scholars imposed a number of restrictions on the military jihad, including the forbidding of the killing of non-combatants and of deliberately killing oneself on the battlefield. Osama ibn Laden and those who follow him sidestep these restrictions by adopting a twisted view of how they should be understood. Suicide bombings are recast as martyrdom operations, and all the people in democracies such as America are seen as being combatants because they participated in the elections that put their governments in place. In another statement issued also in 1998, Osama ibn Laden comments, "If the people of the Western countries do not wish to be harmed inside their very own countries, they should seek to elect governments that are truly representative of them and can protect their interests." But at the same time, he contradicts himself, for elsewhere in the same statement he comments, "We, however, differentiate between the Western government and the people of the West. If the people have elected these governments in the latest elections, it is because they have fallen prey to the Western media, which portrays things contrary to what they really are." So he wants, on the one hand, to make the people of the West valid targets of Al-Qaeda's operations through their being responsible for the actions of their governments. But on the other hand, he also seems to see them as sheep who elect whichever governments they're told to. It's difficult to know what to make of such an internally inconsistent argumentation. Osama ibn Laden was killed by American special forces last May, but of course this hasn't meant the death of counter-crusading rhetoric in Muslim politics. As an example, Colonel Gaddafi of Libya was using such language as early as the 1980s, and he has continued to do so during the recent revolution that's been sweeping the country. He has described the coalition forces enforcing the UN no-fly zone over Libya as waging a new crusader battle launched by crusader countries on Islam. And he's referred to a colonialist crusade of aggression, saying this can lead to open a new crusade war. I think he wants to make sure he's used the word crusade as often as possible. Thus we see continuing links made between the Crusades, the colonial period, and modern actions by Western powers. I should emphasize, of course, that most Muslims see the Crusades as events that happened a long time ago, which do not have immediate bearing on the present. And they see the rhetorical twisting of history by figures like Osama ibn Laden and Colonel Gaddafi for what it really is. But the memory of the Crusades in the Middle East is one that carries more negative connotations than it does in the West, something that is reinforced by such rhetoric, especially in countries such as Syria and Iran, where there is both strict government control of the media and also official state hostility to Western governments. Even Muslims living in the West are nervous of the term crusade, particularly in political rhetoric. As I mentioned earlier, it conjures up negative images of Christian hostility against Muslims. In the wake of 9/11, Muslims living in Western countries feared a backlash against them. In some cases, their fears were well-founded, as they, as well as some non-Muslims who happened not to be white, were hurt or killed by revenge attacks. They were also subject to racial or religious profiling that threatened their rights and liberties. Even now, some Muslims are nervous every time the anniversary of the 9/11 tragedy comes around, as they fear further attacks. As Sumbul Ali Karamali has noted, what is missed is that the majority of Muslims are as frightened of figures like Osama ibn Laden as non-Muslims are, since most Muslims don't adhere to extremist, militant positions, and thus in the eyes of these violent extremists, they're heretics and also potential targets. This is worse for Muslims living in the Middle East, where governments that are less stable have more chance of being subverted by extremists. Now, to conclude, I hope that I've effectively communicated two major points today. First, the period of the Crusades was one that, while we must acknowledge the bitter warfare and bloodshed that took place between Franks and Muslims, also saw Franks and Muslims living in neighboring states peacefully with one another and interacting on a tolerant and sometimes even friendly basis for extended periods of time. Secondly, The counter-crusading rhetoric that receives so much attention in the Western media today, with its representation of the Crusades as a phase in an ongoing war between Islam and Judaism and Christianity, is a modern fabrication used by some figures for primarily political reasons, and it doesn't represent the views of the majority of Muslims living in the world today. As we've seen, the modern rhetoric ignores half the story. It focuses only on the wars that took place between the Muslims and the Crusaders, and it completely neglects the long periods of peaceful interaction that we've examined. So, to suggest an answer to the second question that I posed in the title of this talk, why are the Crusades still relevant? I'd propose that we need to look at the crusading period for an example of how Muslims and non-Muslims might form mutually beneficial, friendly relationships in a world where there is overwhelming pressure to see only the divisions between us. The period saw fierce conflicts between Christians and Muslims that were seen on both sides as being approved by God. Deus vult, God wills it, was the cry with which Urban II's first call to the Crusades was greeted. But despite this, Muslims and Franks enjoyed amicable and collaborative relations in the times between the wars. We must acknowledge that people on both sides of the divide saw those on the other side as religious inferiors, but this didn't prevent them from interacting with one another. It's also clear that their understanding of each other was limited, but again, this didn't stop them from meeting, trading, and enjoying each other's company. We live in a world where there are far more opportunities for Muslims and non-Muslims to interact on a friendly basis. We live in a world in which we have far better access to information than did our forebears in the Middle Ages. And we also live in a world where seeing someone as inferior on the basis of religion is forbidden by UN Charter or UN Declaration. There is, then, no excuse for us not to create deep, meaningful relations at home and abroad with members of the Muslim community, despite the barriers that we encounter in the rhetoric of extremists and the distortions of the media. The Muslims and the Franks of the Middle Ages were able to forge friendly and cooperative relations in a world with even greater obstacles to overcome. Surely we can do better. Yes, sir.
Would you speak of the Children's Crusade?
Okay, yes. There was at one point in the 13th century. Okay, the question was, would I speak to the Children's Crusade? And if my memory serves me correctly, at the beginning of the 13th century, there were a group of children led, actually from a couple of points in Europe, who actually decided that they were going to set out for Jerusalem. And they expected that they were going to be able to walk across the Mediterranean to get there. They got to the coast, realized that this wasn't quite going to work. A number of them, I think a lot of them wound up actually being sold off as slaves eventually, captured and sold off. Yeah, that was one of the. There are a number of quite exciting things that happened during the crusading period as a result of people getting perhaps a little overexcited. There was a village where they decided that that one of the geese in the village was divinely inspired and they were going to follow it on crusade. They got as far as the nearest duck pond. Yes, one of the things that I love about studying the Crusades, actually, is that there are so many interesting and quirky stories told. How many of them are true, we can't say, but quirky stories of all sorts of weird and wonderful things that seem to have happened. Osama is Osama Munker, the chap who was telling stories about Franks finding people in bed with their wives and that sort of stuff, has all sorts of wonderful stories about the crazy things that Franks get up to, which makes him very entertaining. Yes. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
The fourth campaign, they just went to Constantinople and they took it and went back to Europe, never attempted it.
That's correct. The Fourth Crusade was intended to, I think they were planning on attacking Egypt, if I remember correctly. There had been a recognition by then that the key to trying to take control of the Middle East was actually to take control of Egypt. Egypt was the sort of great base from which Saladin and his successors were able to launch the counter-crusade that eventually led to the retaking of Jerusalem in 1187. And thereafter, a number of crusades were launched against Egypt because it was an important target as a result. It was the granary of the Middle East, among other things. But the Fourth Crusade gathered in Italy and was intended to go to Egypt and take the country. But unfortunately, not as many people arrived at Venice to take part in the Fourth Crusade as were expected. So the Venetians, who were providing the shipping, said, well, we don't mind taking you out to the Middle East, but first there's just one or two other little things we'd like to deal with, which involved, first of all, an attack on the Dalmatian coast, and then eventually, by then, the Crusaders had got involved in the literally Byzantine politics of Constantinople, and they wound up taking Constantinople, installing a new Byzantine emperor, but then he refused to pay up what he'd offered them, so they took it again. And this time round, they actually established a Latin state that was there until the late 1268, something like that. So mid to late 13th century. That's left a bit of a sour taste in the memory of the Crusades among Greeks, as I recall. But then the Ottomans came and spoiled things in 1453 too. So it, yeah. Okay, a couple of hands. Yes, over there.
In reality, how much of the Crusades was economic versus religious?
Oh, that's a very good question.
I mean, now and...
What do you mean by now?
Well, I mean, there's made a case that the so-called crusade now, or capturing the Middle East, is actually economic, not.
Oh, yes. I mean, well, if we start with the Middle Ages, I think we can accept that there were people who went on the Crusades for many reasons. Many were motivated by genuine religious piety, but there were some who went because they saw territorial opportunities. In these days, historians tend to play down the idea that every third son of a medieval family had nothing else to do, so therefore went off on crusade, because it's been shown actually that you have whole families who are heavily involved in the crusading movement and this sort of thing. But there were people who probably went because they saw opportunities there to establish territory and set up their own lands. There were some people, actually one of the crusade historians gives a number of reasons why people went on the crusade, and among other things he said some people just went because their friends went, so everybody went. In the modern day, well, I mean, there's a lot of oil in the Middle East, and so how far we should see the activities of Western powers in the Middle East as being motivated by economic concerns and how far we should see them as being motivated by concerns about human rights and other such things is, of course, an open question. I don't consider myself sufficiently expert on the inner thinking of people like George W. Bush to be able to give you a categorical answer to that thing. But I would say it's certainly a factor. And it's quite striking that there are some countries where intervention takes place and there are other countries where it doesn't. Does that answer your question? Kind of. Okay, yes. There was a hand up here. Oh, okay. Whichever.
There was one a long time ago from way back. Whoever is on the very far right. No hands up?
Okay, there's one behind you, though, over there.
All right.
Yes.
What would you say was the end of the Crusades, if any?
Well, as I said, the core crusading period is usually 1095 to 1291. Over the next couple of hundred years, there were plans put together and attempts to conduct operations against the Middle East. 1365, the King of Cyprus conducts a campaign against Alexandria, for example. And there were thinkers who continued to plan crusades in the West for centuries afterwards. But I would say we certainly cannot see a continuum in the between the Crusades and the colonial period. There were people in the colonial period who probably had the Crusades in mind as they went out and were taking over territories in the Middle East. But we can't talk about a widespread crusading movement that continued on throughout the centuries.
You said there was an end point in 1291. What would that have been?
Well, 1291 is...
Did you just fade away?
Well, 1291 is the fall of Acre, which is the last major Christian stronghold on the coast. The Christians continued to hold Cyprus for some time thereafter. But if you want to see the sort of Crusades as being the existence of the Crusader states as defining the crusading period, then that's really the point at which things end. In Spain, of course, it takes a lot longer for them to push the Muslims out. It's 1492. Three things happen in 1492. The fall of Granada, the Jews get expelled from Spain in the same year, and Columbus, of course, goes off to North America, getting there a few centuries later than the Vikings. But a lot of it is about how you label these things, which I realize is kind of complicating rather than answering your question. But that's what historians do. Yes, over there.
I teach grade 8 social studies or year 7 history.
Okay.
And I have 6 classes in which to teach the Crusades.
Oh my.
What would a specialist such as yourself want a 13-year-old British Columbia student to know about this topic?
Yeah. Yes, it's the eternal dilemma of how do you fit several quarts into one pint pot, isn't it? I think, okay, potted version, off the top of my head. I guess you could start off with Urban II, the idea of going out and fighting to liberate the Holy Land from the Muslims. You could talk about, at that sort of level, I suppose you could talk about the great heroes of the Crusades, Richard and Saladin and all that good stuff. I think it's important, grade 8's, 13-year-olds thereabouts, yeah? I think it's important also to emphasize the fact that there were two sides. And you could talk in very general terms about the fact that there is still some relevance today. Does that help? Okay, good. Yes, sir?
How was the Jewish population affected during the Crusades in Europe?
Okay, well, as I said, there was a great, many Jews died during the conquest of Jerusalem in 1099. And of course, if you're a Jew in the Middle Ages, very often you're marginalized, just as a matter of course. Jews continued to live in the Crusader states thereafter, as well as in the Muslim states where they'd been living for centuries. The major thing was that theoretically, at least, they weren't allowed to live in Jerusalem by the Crusaders. That was one of the major restrictions that they operated under. How many Jews actually lived in Jerusalem is open to question. Benjamin of Tudela, who travels in the 12th century throughout the region, and he kind of enumerates all the Jews he discovers as he goes on. And he's using letters as to indicate numbers, of course. And in his account of the number of Jews in Jerusalem, there is a smudged, either Daleth or Resh, I think it is, which could be either 4 or 400 in Jerusalem itself. And we're not quite sure which is true. Some scholars have questioned the idea that lots of Jews were killed during the Crusades. Others, of course, don't. Generally, when the Franks were ruling their territories, they tended to divide everyone up in sort of Latin Christians and everybody else. They had special courts that were set up to deal with inter-religious affairs, inter-religious disputes. A lot of the time, though, they would leave people alone provided they paid their taxes. It's much more useful to keep a non-Christian or non-Latin Christian because the relations between Latin Catholic Christians and the non-Latin Christians were kind of rough. One historian has actually described them as rough tolerance was the way that they operated. But where was I going with that thought? Oh, yes. But it's actually a lot more useful to maintain a population in a particular place with, even if they follow a different religion from the one that you do. Because if they're there working the land and paying you taxes, it's a lot better than if they all leave and then you're left going, okay, I need a bunch of people now to do these fields and things. So it's not a jolly situation being a non-Latin Christian in the Christian states. But at the same time, we're not talking about automatic sort of oppression and random violence. Does that answer your question? Kind of. Yes, the hat at the back.
I caught part of the name of one of the books that you referred to, something, The Crusades by Hildebrand or something. What exactly
Okay,
is
the
that
book
called?
is The Crusades, Islamic Perspectives, and the author is Carol Hillenbrand. And it is, I would say, at the moment, the most important text that we have, most important work of modern scholarship that we have on the Crusades from the Muslim point of view.
Can you spell her last name?
Hillenbrand. She was the external examiner for my PhD, as it happens.
Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. Yes?
Just a simple clarification, please. What territory is encompassed by the Levant?
Good question. When I use the term Levant, I'm thinking really of Turkey going down through Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Israel, down through to Egypt as well. So that sort of curve at the end of the Mediterranean, which I suppose from your perspective is that curve. I guess that's a term that comes from Levant, the place where the sun rises. But that's the Levant, the place where the sun rises, because Levant du Soleil. Oh, I'm thinking of Turkey, then down through Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Israel, down through those countries, Palestinian territories, of course, and Egypt. So that sort of sweep of territory. Yes, sir.
Sorry, crusade question. Maybe on the symbol of the cross, or you call it crucifix. I'm not sure you can call it a crucifix. It's double pronged cross. Is it truly the design used then? And what does it symbol? Especially the split prong.
Okay, that's a cross. That's a variation on the cross that's used primarily in. I'm thinking of the Hospitaller cross, the military orders. If we cycle back, maybe I can find that slide on the St. John's ambulance.
And the St. John ambulance you use.
Yeah, I'm just finding it for you. Where did it go? There. Oops. Stop it. There. That cross. It's the Cross of Malta. It's where it's a Maltese cross, yeah, which is so it's a slight variation on the regular cross. I don't know enough about the symbology of it to be able to give you more details.
Was it truly used then?
Yes, they wore them. It would be embroidered onto a tabard or something. It was a uniform. Yeah. Although that particular variation on the cross really dates from after the end of the crusading period, when the Hospitallers really set themselves up in Malta. And so it's the Maltese cross, if I remember correctly. Any more questions?
Yes.
Okay.
Did the plague have any effect on the Crusades?
Okay, well, the plague sweeps through Europe in the mid-14th century. So it's a bit after the sort of core period of the Crusades, if you like. But that said, there were periodic outbreaks of plague earlier on. And, people did get carried off by the plague from time to time. Actually, at the beginning of the Crusades, there had recently been some very nasty outbreaks of the plague in the Middle East. And there were some people who actually thought that, you've got the approach of the Muslim year 500 in the Muslim calendar. You've got these plagues going on. You've got these invasions coming from Europe. Some people thought the end of the world was coming. And so it did have a psychological effect as well. Yeah.
There's one more question here, and I think there's one here.
Okay, just before I answer those, because I think I can tell by the way that you're sitting there that we're running out of time.
We are approaching running out of time.
Okay, I'd just like to say, if anyone has any questions that they haven't had a chance to ask, please come down to the front, because I have a box of my business cards here, and I'll happily field them by email or phone call or something. Right, yes. So, next question.
Yep, in the back.
Yes, sir.
In your talk, you mentioned the mullahs, the Muslim leaders.
Yes.
They did have a larger effect. Would you not also call their actions crusades? Because they also, shall we say, raided Northern Europe. Some of their artifacts have been found in archaeological digs along the Volga, in Russia did.
Yes.
So, I mean, they have had quite a powerful effect in Muslim history. Is that?
Well, I mean, Muslim military expeditions that were conducted in any particular region of the world, if you like, were generally conducted under the banner of the military jihad. So, I mean, that certainly is, if you like, an Islamic practice that is analogous to the idea of crusade in Europe.
I'm thinking of one of the Ottoman leaders.
Okay, yeah.
Who had a, shall we say, a consort who was herself French.
Right.
She was born in France.
Mm-hmm.
And in the raid that they did on the southern coast, she was kidnapped as a child. Europe, both Ireland, England, Wales, Norway, had backs of these raids. Would you not also call that part of the Crusades?
I'd call it part of the military jihad in terms of sort of the... I mean, when you talk about crusade, you're talking about, in the Middle Ages, you're talking about Christian expeditions against others.
Muslims also did crusades.
Well, they conducted military jihad, which is the Muslim equivalent of the Crusades, but only in a sort of general sense. It's holy war either side of the divide, however you slice it, yeah.
Well, I think that's it. We've really had a wonderful time, Neil. Thank you so much. And he's graciously offered to answer more questions. Not many people bring a whole box of business cards, so thank you so much.
You're very welcome.